Okay, so you know how we're all about like diving deep into these kind of sort of out there religious ideas?
Hmm.
Well, get ready to go down the rabbit hole because this time we're tackling perennialism.
Okay.
And in a nutshell, it's this idea that all religions, even though they seem so different on the surface,
Right.
are really tapping into the same like universal truth.
Interesting.
But here's where things get a little more complicated.
Okay.
The article we're looking at today throws a huge curveball because it's written by an Orthodox Christian,
Uh-huh.
and not just any Orthodox Christian, but one who's totally convinced that their faith is the only true path.
Wow, that's kind of surprising, right?
Yeah.
You'd think someone so sure about one specific religion wouldn't be too keen on the whole all religions are kind of the right thing.
Right, exactly. It's like, talk about a head scratcher, you know? But what's really wild is that this author, they don't just like dismiss all other religions outright.
Oh, really?
Yeah, get this. They actually own religious texts from all sorts of faiths.
Yeah.
We're talking like the Quran, the Book of Mormon, the whole shebang. It's like they're, I don't know, searching for these little nuggets of truth in the most unexpected places.
So it's like they're trying to find those common threads, those universal truths that might be woven throughout all these different belief systems.
Okay, so I'm already hooked, right? But here's the million-dollar question. How can someone believe so strongly in their own faith, like to the point where they're convinced it's the only way to salvation,
Right.
and yet still find value in these other religions that, according to their beliefs, are kind of, well, wrong?
Yeah. Yeah, I see what you mean. That's a tough one. And the author actually tackles this head on. They use this really interesting analogy of like surviving a plane crash without a parachute.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. So they're saying, sure, it's technically possible. I mean, there have been a handful of people who've lived to tell the tale, right? But would you ever bet your life on it?
So are they basically saying that, like, dabbling in other faiths might seem harmless on the surface, but when it comes to, you know, your eternal soul, you're better off sticking with the path you believe in?
Exactly. It's like you can appreciate the different approaches, but at the end of the day, you got to have faith in the path you've chosen. And for this author, that path is, of course, Orthodox Christianity.
Okay, that makes sense. And to really get where they're coming from, I guess we need a little crash course in Orthodox Christianity itself. I mean, I know they're like a big branch of Christianity, but what makes them unique?
Well, think of them as like the OG Christians. They trace their lineage straight back to the early church, and they're all about tradition. Like they haven't really bought into many of the, how do I put this? The new and improved versions of Christianity that have popped up over the centuries.
Right, right. They're not exactly known for being like wishy-washy about their beliefs, are they?
Not really, no. They're pretty firm in their convictions.
Okay, so that totally makes sense. But then the author throws this other curveball, and it's a big one.
Oh.
They see paganism, which, you know, predates Christianity by a long shot, as like this, I don't know, distorted echo of the original truth.
Well, hold on. Did I hear that right? They see paganism as having some connection to the truth. That's pretty unexpected, coming from someone so deeply rooted in Orthodox Christianity.
Right. It seems kind of counterintuitive, doesn't it?
It does. It definitely goes against the grain of how many people view these two belief systems.
Mm-hmm.
You've got Christianity on one hand and paganism, which is often associated with, well, let's be honest, all sorts of misconceptions and stereotypes on the other. So to see them as somehow linked is pretty mind-blowing.
It really is. And it makes you wonder, like, what exactly are they seeing in paganism that even hints at the truth? It's like they're saying, hey, there's something here worth paying attention to, even if it's buried under layers of, you know, what they would consider to be distortions or misunderstandings.
And this is where their interpretation of the Tower of Babel story gets really interesting.
Okay, the Tower of Babel, right. So for those who might not be familiar, it's this this biblical story where humanity tries to build this massive tower to reach heaven.
Mm-hmm. Humanity tries to become like God.
Exactly. And God's like, nope, not going to happen. So he creates all these different languages, throws everyone into total confusion, and bam, no more tower, no more unified humanity.
Right. And the author's take on this is key to understanding their whole perspective on paganism. They believe that when humanity's languages were scattered, so too was their once unified faith. This fragmentation, they argue, is how we got polytheism, the worship of many gods, which they see as a deviation from the belief in one true God.
Okay. So humanity messes up, tries to build a stairway to heaven, God's not having it, and suddenly we have language barriers, different cultures, fractured faiths, the whole 9 yards. It's like this kind of like original sin that throws everything out of whack, right? But where do these truth echoes, as you call them, fit in with paganism specifically?
Well, they use a really intriguing example, snake worship,
Mm.
which, believe it or not, has some fascinatingly contradictory interpretations. You've got some cultures where snakes represent wisdom, healing, even life itself.
Right, like the whole rod of Asclepius thing, right?
Yeah,
That snake entwined staff that's still like the symbol of medicine today.
exactly. It's fascinating how that image has endured. But then on the flip side, you have the serpent in the Garden of Eden, right? The embodiment of temptation, deceit, the whole shebang. It's like this perfect example of how the same symbol can hold completely opposite meanings in different cultures, different belief systems.
It's almost like a game of religious telephone, Like the original message gets passed down and whispered through generations, and somewhere along the line it gets like jumbled and misinterpreted, and you end up with all these variations on a theme.
Right. And the author is saying that both interpretations, the positive and the negative, contain a grain of truth. But over time, those truths become distorted, fragmented, almost like they're seen through a broken mirror.
Okay, I'm with you so far. But then the author makes this really, really bold claim that I'm not sure I quite follow. They say that Christianity actually did a better job of fulfilling paganism's yearning for atonement than even Judaism.
Oh, yeah.
Which, whoa, hold on a second. Because isn't Judaism like the religion that Christianity itself came from?
Right.
So how could Christianity be a better fulfillment of like pagan beliefs than the very faith that spring from? That seems kind of backwards, doesn't it?
Yeah, it definitely throws you for a loop, doesn't it? But the author has a very specific line of reasoning here, and it all comes down to how they view the concept of sacrifice.
Exactly.
It all goes back to, like, the core of paganism. They were all about offering sacrifices to please the gods, right? To, like, keep things in balance, ensure a good harvest, that kind of thing.
Right, right. It was all about appeasing those gods, keeping them on their good side.
Exactly. And the author's point is that this whole system of sacrifice shows how aware they were of humanity's need for atonement. Like, they knew they weren't perfect. They knew they needed to make things right with the powers that be. They were already, in a way, searching for that bridge between themselves and the divine, even if their understanding of the divine was, well, a little different from how Christians see it.
So it's like they were already asking the right questions, even if they didn't have the full picture, the complete answer yet.
Right. And that's why the author believes that when Christianity came along with this whole idea of Jesus as the ultimate sacrifice, the one true sacrifice that could atone for all of humanity's sins, it resonated with that deep-seated need for atonement that was already present in paganism. It's like Christianity provided the answer to a question that paganism had been grappling with for centuries.
Okay, I see what you mean. It's like Christianity slotted right into this existing framework of belief and provided like the missing piece of the puzzle.
Exactly. And this actually leads to another point that the author makes, and it's one that I found particularly interesting.
Okay, I'm listening.
It has to do with their view of ancient Greek philosophy.
Wait, seriously. Greek philosophy, like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, that whole crew.
The very same. Now, you wouldn't necessarily think that an Orthodox Christian, someone deeply rooted in their faith and tradition, would have much good to say about a bunch of pagan philosophy.
Right. Those guys were like the rock stars of the ancient world, but they were about as pagan as it gets. I mean, they were all about worshiping the Greek gods and goddesses, exploring these big philosophical questions that, didn't exactly line up with Christian theology.
Exactly. And yet the author actually expresses a lot of respect for these thinkers, especially Plato and Aristotle.
Okay, now my mind is officially blown. Why on earth would an Orthodox Christian have any respect for those guys? What gives?
Well, the author makes this really interesting argument that even within systems of belief that are flawed or incomplete, you can still find these glimmers of truth, these echoes of something bigger than themselves.
Okay, so it's like those truth echoes we were talking about earlier with paganism, right? It's like they're popping up again, but this time in the realm of philosophy.
Exactly. And the author argues that some of the ideas that Plato and Aristotle were wrestling with, ideas about ethics, the nature of reality, the good life, they kind of laid the groundwork, paved the way for some of the core concepts that would later become central to Christian theology.
So it's not like Plato had it all figured out or anything. It's not like he was secretly a proto-Christian or anything like that. But his ideas, his philosophical explorations, they kind of created this fertile ground where some of these seeds of Christian thought could take root.
Exactly. And the author even points out that the early church fathers, those super influential thinkers who helped to shape Christian theology in those crucial early centuries, they actually drew upon the works of Plato and Aristotle.
Wow, no kidding. They were actually reading those ancient Greek texts and finding like points of connection, things that resonated with their own developing understanding of the Christian faith.
Exactly. They weren't afraid to find common ground, even with thinkers from a completely different religious background. And I think that says a lot about how open-minded those early church fathers were. They were willing to look for wisdom wherever they could find it, even in the writings of pagan philosophers.
It's like they were saying, hey, these guys were onto something, even if they didn't have the full picture. And it really makes you think about like how we engage with ideas that are different from our own.
Yeah.
Are we so quick to dismiss them, to write them off as wrong or irrelevant? Or are we open to the possibility that maybe, just maybe, there's something there worth listening to, something that might actually enrich our own understanding of the world?
That's a really good point, and it's something that the author emphasizes throughout the article. They're very careful to make it clear that this whole idea of finding truth echoes in other belief systems doesn't mean that all religions are the same or that Christianity is just like a hodgepodge of borrowed ideas.
Right, right. They're not saying that all roads lead to Rome, so to speak.
Exactly. The author still very much believes that Orthodox Christianity holds the complete and final revelation of truth. But they're also acknowledging that those truths, those echoes of something bigger than ourselves, they can be found in the most unexpected places, even in traditions that seem completely at odds with Christianity, like paganism or ancient Greek philosophy.
Okay, so that makes sense. They're not saying that every religion is equally true, but they are saying that truth itself isn't necessarily confined to one single tradition. It's like they're saying that truth can transcend those boundaries, those labels that we put on things.
Exactly. And this brings up a really interesting question, one that the author tackles head on. We've talked about how they see these truth echoes in paganism and even in ancient Greek philosophy, traditions that came before Christianity. But what about those religions that came after? Specifically, what about Judaism and Islam? These are faiths that didn't just predate Christianity. They arose in response to it. They weren't exactly trying to jump on the Jesus bandwagon.
Right, exactly. They were carving out their own paths, and those paths led them in a different direction.
Exactly. And this is where things get really interesting because the author sees these post-Christian faiths as, well, kind of a different beast altogether.
Because it wasn't just that they were choosing a different path, it's that they were consciously choosing a path that, at least in the author's view, directly challenged the core claims of Christianity. It's one thing to have different interpretations of a shared history or tradition, but it's another thing entirely to say, nope, we're not on board with this whole Jesus thing.
Right. It's like they were presented with what the author believes to be the truth, and instead of embracing it, they went, nope, we're going to do our own thing. And in the author's view, that makes all the difference.
Okay, so it's not just that these faiths are different, it's that their very existence represents a kind of a conscious rejection of what the author sees as the ultimate truth. So are they saying that there's absolutely no truth to be found in these faiths? Or is it more nuanced than that?
It's definitely nuanced. And I wouldn't say they completely write off these faiths. Remember those truth echoes we've been talking about? Well, the author believes they're still present, even in Judaism and Islam. But they're even more fragmented, more distorted, precisely because these faiths arose in direct opposition to what the author sees as, well, the real deal.
So it's like those echoes are still there, but they're fainter, harder to make out because they've been bouncing around in this echo chamber of opposition, so to speak.
Exactly. It's like trying to listen for a whisper in the middle of a hurricane. You know it's there, but it's almost impossible to make out the words. But even here, in these faiths that the author sees as fundamentally opposed to Christianity, they still find those intriguing glimmers of truth shining through.
Really? Like what? Give me an example.
Well, they mention how they found certain passages in the Talmud, those Jewish texts, that are so important to Jewish tradition and law. And they find it fascinating that some of these passages actually seem to support Orthodox Christian views even more than some modern Jewish interpretations.
So even in these texts that are the foundation of a completely different religion, a religion that the author sees as having veered off course from the truth, they still see these glimpses, these echoes of their own faith.
Exactly. It's like these little winks from the universe, these little hints that maybe, just maybe, truth has a way of popping up in the most unexpected places. And this takes us back to that core question that we've been circling around this whole time. If there's truth to be found in all these different religions and all these different belief systems, does that undermine the idea of one true faith.
Right, like if there are all these different paths up the mountain, doesn't that kind of imply that maybe there's not just one summit?
Exactly. And this is where things get really interesting. The author doesn't shy away from this question. They address it head on. They acknowledge the danger of falling into what they call the all religions are equal trap.
Right, right, which is a pretty tempting trap to fall into these days, let's be honest. Like, in our modern world where we're constantly being told to be tolerant and accepting of everyone's beliefs, it's easy to slip into this mindset that all religions are basically just different paths leading to the same destination.
Exactly. And the author sees that kind of thinking, that kind of relativism, as a dangerous, slippery
Thanks.
slope. Because if all religions are equally true, then does it really matter what you believe? Do any of these beliefs actually hold any real weight?
Right, if everyone's right, then isn't everyone also kind of wrong?
Exactly. And the author is arguing that this kind of thinking can actually undermine faith itself. Because if there's no hierarchy of truth, then what's the point of seeking truth at all?
Okay, I see what you mean. It's like if every answer is equally valid, then what's the point of asking the question in the first place? So, if the author acknowledges the danger of this all religions are equal trap, how do they reconcile that with their belief that these truth echoes can be found in all these different faiths?
That's a great question, and it gets to the very heart of the author's argument. They believe that recognizing these truth echoes, these glimpses of something bigger than ourselves that are scattered throughout different traditions, actually strengthens their belief in Orthodox Christianity rather than weakening it.
Wait, really? Explain that one to me. Because on the surface, it seems like it would do the opposite, right? Like, if you're saying that other religions have these elements of truth, doesn't that kind of chip away at the idea that your religion is the one true faith?
It's counterintuitive, right, but the author sees it as a kind of validation. They compare it to finding pieces of a mosaic scattered throughout history. You might have these beautiful fragments, these intricate pieces of tile, but they don't really make sense until you put them together in the right order according to the right pattern.
So they're saying that these other religions, these other belief systems, they might have these beautiful fragments of truth, but they're just that, fragments. They don't form a complete picture on their own.
Exactly. They're like pieces of a puzzle that have been scattered to the wind. And only one picture, one complete image, makes sense of all the pieces. And for the author, that picture is Orthodox Christianity.
So it's not about dismissing other faiths outright or saying that they're completely devoid of truth. It's about recognizing that they might contain these glimpses, these echoes of a larger truth, a truth that the author believes finds its fullest, most complete expression in their own faith.
Precisely. And to illustrate this point, the author brings up a really interesting contemporary example. They talk about this thinker named Academic Agent.
Academic agent, okay. And what does this academic agent have to say about all of this?
Well, they're not talking about religion in the traditional sense.
Hmm.
Academic Agent actually finds a lot of value in the I Ching. You're familiar with it?
The I Ching. I feel like I've heard of it, but I can't quite place it. Refresh my memory.
Right. So the I Ching is this ancient Chinese text. It's all about divination, interpreting these patterns of lines called hexagrams.
Yeah.
To gain insight into like life's big questions, make important decisions. Not exactly your typical religious text.
Right, not exactly what you'd find in a church pew. So what's the connection here? What does this I Ching have to do with Christianity or perennialism for that matter?
Well, that's the fascinating part. Even though the I Ching comes from a completely different tradition, a completely different cultural and philosophical worldview, Academic Agent sees these really interesting parallels between its teachings and certain core tenets of Christianity.
Okay, now you've got to give me some specifics here. Like, what kind of parallels are we talking about?
Well, for example, they see a connection between the I Ching's emphasis on humility and the Beatitudes. Those teachings of Jesus from the Sermon on the Mount.
Right, right. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. That whole thing.
Exactly. So you've got these two completely different sources, one ancient Chinese text and one of the most famous sermons in Christian history, and yet they seem to be touching on this shared value, this shared insight into the importance of humility.
So even though they're coming from totally different starting points, different traditions, different contexts, there's this point of intersection, this overlap where they seem to be saying, hey, we might not agree on everything, but this humility thing, this is important.
Exactly. And the author uses this example to show that these truth echoes, they can pop up in the most unexpected places, even in traditions that, on the surface, seem to have absolutely nothing to do with Christianity.
It reminds me of those Jesuit missionaries who went to China and Japan centuries ago. Weren't they trying to do something similar, like finding common ground between Christianity and these Eastern philosophies?
Oh, absolutely. The Jesuit example is a fascinating one, and it actually ties into this whole conversation about perennialism in a really interesting way.
Mm.
Because the Jesuit, they were walking this tightrope between trying to share their faith and trying to understand and appreciate the cultures they were encountering.
And didn't that get them into some hot water with the church back home? Like, weren't they accused of going too far, of compromising too much in their efforts to make Christianity more palatable to these other cultures?
Oh, absolutely. It caused a huge rift within the church, with some praising the Jesuits for their cultural sensitivity and others accusing them of straight-up heresy.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because even within a single religion, even within Christianity itself, you have these different interpretations, these different approaches to truth. It's like everyone's trying to figure out how to fit these puzzle pieces together, and they don't always agree on the picture they're trying to create.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole discussion about perennialism so compelling,
Mm.
because it forces us to confront this messy, complex reality that truth, or at least our understanding of truth, is constantly evolving.
Yeah.
It's not this static, fixed thing. It's fluid, it's dynamic. And the author, despite their strong belief in one true faith, seems to embrace that complexity.
It's like this whole conversation we've been having is a microcosm of the bigger picture. We've got all these different perspectives, all these different interpretations, all these different traditions, and they're all bumping up against each other, sometimes clashing, sometimes harmonizing, and sometimes just kind of coexisting in this, like this grand symphony of human belief. But before we get too carried away with this symphony of ideas, I'm dying to know, what is this intriguing note that the author ends the article on? They leave us with one final thought that you said really makes you think about how we view the evolution of religion. So what is this final thought? What does the author leave us pondering?
Well, they were talking about, the evolution of Islam, specifically how the really early forms of the faith were open to some practices that later interpretations, well, they kind of frowned upon.
Oh, interesting. Like what
Yeah.
what kind of practices?
Like the veneration of saints, for example. And get this, they even had a rich iconographic tradition.
Wait, hold up. Are you saying that early Islam had iconography? Like with images and stuff? Because that seems, I don't know, kind of at odds with my understanding of Islam, with the whole emphasis on avoiding idolatry and all that.
Right. It's one of those things that you don't really hear about, like it got kind of swept under the rug as Islam evolved and different interpretations came to the forefront. But yeah, there was a time when mosques were adorned with these incredibly beautiful, intricate geometric patterns, calligraphy, even depictions of like important figures.
Wow, that's incredible. I had no idea. So are they suggesting that those early forms of Islam with their more, I don't know, outward expressions of faith were somehow closer to the truth than later interpretations?
It's definitely implied. And it's a really, really interesting point to consider, right? Because it challenges us to think about, like, what happens when a religion evolves? Are those changes always for the better? Or do they sometimes represent kind of like a drifting away from the original message, a clouding of the original truth?
Man, that's a heavy question. It's like, how do we even begin to evaluate that? Because on the one hand, you could say that those early forms of Islam were like pure, less influenced by, political or cultural forces. But then on the other hand, you could argue that those later interpretations, even if they did away with some of the outward expressions of faith, were actually a more sophisticated, more nuanced understanding of the religion's core teachings. It's like, who are we to say which version is better or truer?
Right. And that's the beauty of it, right? This whole discussion about perennialism, about these echoes of truth that seem to reverberate throughout different traditions, it opens up all these doors, all these possibilities. It forces us to question our assumptions, to grapple with the fact that maybe, just maybe, we don't have all the answers.
And maybe that's okay. Maybe it's in that space of uncertainty, that space of not knowing, that we really start to learn and grow.
Exactly. It's like this whole deep dive has been one giant question mark. And that's not a bad thing, because it's in asking the questions, in wrestling with these big, messy, complicated ideas that we start to see the world and ourselves in a new light.
It's like that old saying, right? The more you learn, the more you realize how much you don't know. And I think that's a good place to leave it for today, folks. We've covered a lot of ground, explored some pretty wild ideas, and hopefully left you with more questions than answers. Because at the end of the day, that's what this is all about, isn't it? Asking the tough questions, staying curious, and being open to the possibility that truth might be found in the most unexpected places. So until next time, keep those minds open, Keep those ears perked for those echoes of truth, and most importantly, keep on diving deep.